Voilà, et je te laisse, Morad, le soin en fait, de transmettre à notre invité ce que j'ai dit. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Jeremy, if you understood like what Professor Azizi said a little bit. Okay. Okay, so he's like just welcoming you, and it is a plus, it is another value for our laboratory to host you. He is also welcoming the students who are always like attending the most of the events that we and most of the encounters. So I think like we will start. So the students are still joining, but I know, Jeremy, that maybe this is the constraint of time and this is the morning in the United States. So let me just say hello to everyone. As you know, today we are very glad to host writer and artist Jeremy Hight, whose work covers diverse areas and methods. Before introducing our honorable guest, let me first thank you for your being here. And I also want to thank, as I said before, the president of the university, Sidi Mohamed bin Abdellah, the Dean of the Faculty of Letters and Human Sciences and Sais, and finally, Professor Abdelmounim El Azouzi, the head of the laboratory, Language, Literature, Imaginaire, and Esthétique. Our guest today, Jeremy Hight, is a prolific writer who has written a number of works both in print and electronic. He is internationally credited with the invention of locative writing, which I think he is going to further explain during his intervention. Jeremy is the author of the short story collections I Am the Ghost Here, What Remains and Easy and Clear. His first novel, The Ghost in You, was published in 2019. His poetry has been published internationally, and his essays, like on various subjects, have been translated into many languages. He invented the field of locative narrative with the Project 34 North, 118 West, and his digital poetry work, Caritho Parkfield Diaries, is in the permanent digital collection of the Whitney Museum. He has an MFA in creative writing from Carl's Arts. He is currently working on a new type of text that incorporates the dynamics of mathematics. Now I am going to pass the floor to writer and artist Jeremy Hight to introduce us to his creative universe. Then we proceed with questions from the audience. The floor is yours, dear Jeremy.
I had a question for you. Would you like to
Yes.
do a Q? Would you like to do a Q and A with me?
First, like I would
Oh,
like
sure.
you to
Introduction.
introduce, yes, just to introduce your
Sure,
work, like
sure.
so that I'm familiar with that, but the students like need to be familiar with it.
Okay,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
So it'll be 20 years this August. Um, the story version is my friend left a message on my answering machine. For you young people, we used to use answering machines. I tease my students about that, but from a different time, there was a message on my machine, and my friend said something about GPS and trains. Merry Christmas, and I went, wait, what? And this is before smartphones. This is before uh, Siri and Alexa and everything. And so we would gather, and we knew there was something, but we didn't know what it was. And the first idea that hit me was, as a writer, I could take someone to a physical part of the landscape. I could take you to a broken building from war or earthquake, and you'd get the heartache of a character. I could take you to a dry riverbed. Like we're having a 1,000 year drought here. I could take you to a dry riverbed and you could feel the angst of a character. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. We research and we're looking at old maps and a lot of very problematic history, honestly, of California that you see in old newspapers on microfiche. And then I was crossing the street one day. We're going to get burrito mojados, which is a burrito with sauce, which is delicious. And I stopped traffic, and I'm lucky I didn't get hit by a car. My brain, I'm a very visual learner, even though I'm mostly a text-based person, but I get my ideas in pictures sometimes. So the picture appears in my head, and it was kind of a silly image, but it was a microscope of someone looking down. But what if the creature on the slide, say it was a living slide, a microorganism looked up and you could see its perspective, and cars are honking at me, my friends are waving frantically, what are you doing, what are you doing? And I interpreted the image in my head and I went, I'm thinking from a writer's perspective, and as a writer that's interesting, but that's minimizing it because no one knows what the paramecium's thoughts are, no one knows what the lost bits are. So I call it narrative archaeology, and the essay is now, pretty well known, and I'm happy to say it appears on the Google search on the top, which is a pretty awesome tribute to my work. But the realization was, what about the history? Here in Los Angeles, people hear of the Los Angeles Dodgers, the baseball team, but there were Latino neighborhoods that were destroyed to build that stadium, and you don't know that history unless you take an ethnic studies class. The 10 freeway is a famous freeway. It also destroyed old neighborhoods. Those are lost histories. What about people from eras that aren't as resonant in the current culture? It's like they disappear, like a kind of ghost. And so the pointer that people actually use when they walk through the project, we actually use, it's a very subtle metaphor. It's the Ouija board thing that you push across the board to contact the spirit world. But in a sense, history can be lost sort of spirits or ghosts. And so the project instead was stories, but they were stories based on actual history. And the more interesting part as we developed it was that we can give history a voice. And what's happening now that's really interesting, I've written essays later on saying, wouldn't it be great? But now people are starting to build databases where there are certain pockets of a geophysical internet. Like if you want to know about a certain city, Casablanca, New York, San Francisco, what's starting to happen is you can actually travel across it on a map, and you can see archives, and you can dig different directions through it where that would be much harder to find. And I think it's much more dynamic, which is exciting. But yeah, that was from that project. And then really quickly after that, so then it went virally famous. After at first nobody cared, and then it was viral for about 3 weeks, which was a strange experience, but again, an honor. And then it stopped, and I was 32 years old going, is that it? Do I now become a ghost? Do I disappear? And then I was on a panel about nature and art at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and a woman said, you have any ideas about nature? And I said, I've experienced a lot of earthquakes from where I live. I wonder if the earthquake was dissipating. I originally wanted to be a research scientist, by the way. I was going to be a meteorologist, but I wasn't very good at math, so I love science. I incorporate a lot of everything into my work, but I love science. And so the wave, the seismology dissipates at a certain point, but if you get to a fine soil, like you can see it in videos of Japan, you can see it in earthquakes in San Francisco. There's videos of the earthquake in Japan, and it looks like it's water, but a lot of it is it sounds very strange, but it actually resonates the soil till it works like water, and it causes more damage. And later research I found is that a tuning fork, like say you're a musician, like I used to be a musician, and you want to get your tuning correct, you hit a tuning fork, boom. It turns out that a dissipating wave, when it gets near the base of mountains or hills, it resonates them and you get more damage. And so the parallel that I thought of was, what if you're scared of the dark and the lights go out and you're a child and there's an earthquake? Wouldn't that seem more psychologically damaging, even though it wasn't as much physical damage? Is there a parallel that I can find between the two? And so we did a lot of research, and my wonderful partner, who I'm now curating digital art with again, we actually lost touch for a few years, used to be a hacker and is now a coder. So it ran live for a year, now it's archived, but we actually hacked the San Andreas fault, the huge quake fault. So for a year, the DJ that edited the thing was the Earth itself. So we collaborate on earthquakes with the Earth, and then it's in the Whitney now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, like based on what you said, Jeremy, and reading your work, I always see this blurring of boundaries between literature, technology, and science. And
Yes.
this is very important because here in Morocco, especially for our students, we still have that clear-cut distinction
Mm.
between literature and science. Like when you think of literature, you think like the opposite of science. And when you think about science, you are assumed not to read literature. What can you tell us about this, Mr. Jeremy?
That's one of the most important things in my life that I've fought against. Like the cliche would be the boat against the tide. I was taught that there are dual polarities in the brain, the left brain, right brain thing, which I'm glad my students here, at least, most of them aren't taught that anymore. So yeah, it was logical, practical, pragmatic science, architecture, engineering, flowery, poetic music, writing. And I always thought, because as a little kid, I mean, I was an odd little kid. I love philosophy, I love literature, I love writing, but I loved all fields of science. And I read all of them as a little kid. And they all fascinated me. And I had to make a decision at one point in high school. I don't think I can be a research scientist. My plan since I was 7 years old actually was to get a PhD in experimental meteorology and do a 3D modeling of a hypothetical unusual weather events, but I'm not good at algebra, so that's a problem. And it was a really hard decision at 17, but I had to realize, but what I loved about meteorology, it's an inexact science. It's a sort of bastard child of science. No one knows why some hurricanes have a lot of lightning and most don't. No one knows why certain tornadoes will shift and they'll move a different direction, which is the most damaging one in our recent history. It just did that, and no one knows exactly why. We kind of understand ball lightning now. That when I was a little boy, I had to go to the spooky occult area to read about ball lightning, and then one scientist, I think it was in 1980, he was actually a biologist, I believe, was on a plane, and a little ball of plasma during a thunderstorm outside moved along and then popped like a soap bubble, and he gave a talk, and it's now considered science. So in a few years, well, 10 years ago, I was an editor and curator for MIT Press, and I did a little sneaky thing that they let me do, where I did a thing that was called Crossing Boundaries, and it was about cartography, because, you know, my GPS work, that's all mapping in a sense. Well, it's on a map. And GPS originally was military guidance for smart bombs, so there's that history, whether you like it or not, on all GPS signal. But what I really was doing, and I didn't tell anybody except my chief editor, was I had works by poets, I had works by writers that use mapping, I had works by people that do cartography as art, but I had work as cartographers. There's a really powerful work that a woman had shown in the New York Times, and I was really happy that she agreed to share it with us. She's a professor at Harvard. That you see these big red squares on a map in New York City, and they're called $1 million blocks. But the $1 million isn't on education, it's not on food. These are some of the poorest areas in New York City, you know, pre-gentrification, but mostly still the same. The $1 million was on the prison of those people. And so what she pointed out is that you can get $1 million in infrastructure for incarceration, but not what caused it. But the reason I called it Crossing Boundaries, it wasn't about mapping. It was, I'm going to show you all these things that you think aren't related, but they completely are.
Yeah, like I read in your biography that you are trying to incorporate mathematics into the text. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey where some of my most important papers recently, I had to study, one of them, then I'll get to that, was I was trying to figure out, I've done a lot of work that's interactive. I've been doing new media art. I know a lot of new media art. I curate it. But interactivity is interesting, but it's always felt sort of limiting to me. And the GPS project, what was frustrating to me was if you've ever gone to a bowling alley and you've gone bowling, the pins are always reset. So that GPS project, and a lot of them like it, it's very important what they opened up, but the pins always reset. What I really wanted to do was, what if you turn a certain way and you look and it changes? Or we almost did a project at the concentration camps for the Japanese Americans, like my wife, and we didn't get the funding, and my partners dropped it, which I really don't think it was a good idea. But we were talking about more of the living history. What if you had different things that happen in the morning when the children played in the camp? What if you could hear the voices of the older people, that the seniors that made alcohol secretly? There were lovers, like one of her relatives, that would whisper through a barbed wire fence. That's not static history. Those things are more sort of malleable and dynamic, but we don't usually get a chance to sense it that way. So that's important to me. Oh yeah, sorry, I almost forgot my point. Sorry, it's early. So I was trying to think of internal interactivity, and I was frustrated. I couldn't think of it. So I spent a year researching organic chemistry and biology, and I finally got two models, and one of them was as a little kid, you fall off your bicycle or you fall when you're playing and you cut your arm and it magically heals. So when you get into technology, there's things called swarm bots, or in science there's swarm intelligence, like a group of bees will kill the attacking wasps by temperature. They just do it. So it's like a collective intelligence. Your cells, as far as we understand, have no intelligence whatsoever. They simply function. But there's some amazing thing where they reconstruct and there's no wound. And I thought, that's interactivity from the inside. That's interesting. But I couldn't get how the structure would work. And then I researched, it's called the alkane series. So if you have, say, 2 carbons, I think 4 hydrogens, that's, let's say, methane gas. If you add a carbon and 4 more hydrogens, I'm probably wrong, but it's a symmetrical balance. It becomes butane, a different gas. And I thought, that's it. If I have a narrative and I add another character, that complicates the narrative, my writing background. If I add different complications in inner problems or outer problems, a narrative, it would grow and be cohesive. If I have an art project that has different variables that it struggles with. This isn't AI exactly. I've done work with AI, but that's different. I'm slowly getting to the math part because it's pretty funky. But that was the model, and I published a few papers and I made a few projects that are internally variable, and it works. So you tie that to the video game idea of bonus Easter eggs and databases that are triggered by variables within it, and it works. So then the math thing has been an idea I've had for several years. I still have a long way to go. I thankfully have coders and mathematicians. I'm building a team because the basic idea is, how could a text move in 5-dimensional space? And if you met me at a party or saw me at a park sitting there and I said that, you would run away going, he's definitely touched and he's needs help. But I have friends that are mathematicians, and that was the area that I struggled with in meteorology. But I love math. I used to tell my students I don't like math. I love math. Math is beautiful. I just lost it midway in my training. So in a mathematical space, you can do a calculus. I had a wonderful student. I'll make this short because I really miss her. We lost touch because she lost her student visa. A long story about America, unfortunately. But she said she was a concert pianist as a young little girl. She was a prodigy, but she was self-aware enough that she said, and I knew prodigies. I almost was a prodigy, I guess, which is a troubled term. But a lot of my friends that were prodigies, it's memorization, but she realized that. Like 90% of child music prodigies stop playing music when they reach puberty, and it sounds weird, but they realize the emotional beauty of music, and they realize that I have to relearn it, and a lot of people just stop. She was self-aware as a young child, which is amazing, and she said, I just memorized a lot. She played to 10,000 people at 7 years old. She goes, I was just a memorization machine. And then she was a child painter at 11, and she goes, yeah, I was just decent. I wasn't great. They gave me credit because I was 11. I thought, that's amazing that you understand that. Because she was 19 and she was a third-year calculus tutor already. But she told me, I said, when did you fall in love with mathematics? And she drew an equation on the board, and I said, I don't understand that. And she drew another equation, and I said, I don't understand it. And she said, I just created a glass in 3-dimensional space, and then I just turned it around for you. And I went, oh. And she said, I want to transfer to Caltech, and I want to find the beauty, the music and poetry in mathematics. And what I didn't understand when I was a younger person was when you get to higher mathematics, it's beautiful. Absolutely. And in fact, what's interesting, I have a friend who's an astrophysicist, and when you do an equation as an astrophysicist, and there's one part that you just can't answer, you put G/D, non-theological God, and it means it's beyond human comprehension. It's time, and it's not incorrect. We were not taught that you could do that in math in high school. That's amazing. And that gets very philosophical. So I told her, I said, I want to find the mathematics that writing can approach. Writing, it's like, this is the model in the paper that I wrote about it. It sounds really strange, but my brother's a self-taught engineer. If you create something and it simply works, like one of my dreams since I was a kid was to basically create shoelaces, just something that pragmatically people just go, yeah, of course. So in engineering, that's a great success. Think about the modern toilet that's been around for a century or more. No one's thought to change it, even though there are more sophisticated models. There are ones that can give your vitals. You can get an automatic bidet. It can warm you to the proper temperature, but no one's thought to change it. So I do all my theoretical work. I just use MS Word. MS Word hasn't changed since I was an undergrad many years ago. It's a toilet. It works. But how do you capture the dynamics of 3D space? How do you capture movement? How do you capture acceleration like Einstein was fascinated with? Why is it that he was so obsessed with his thought experiments? How could you capture that? I've had students that are applied math majors. How could I allow you to create a demonstration where the text demo isn't a PowerPoint, but it functions like your math research? So that's what I'm working on. I know there's something there. I haven't been able to touch it quite yet, but there's something really amazing there.
Yeah, like that's what makes your work innovative, especially when really it's challenging for the people who are not like familiar with this, but it's really innovative. I really enjoy it myself. So not to be like authoritative, I will open the floor to the other like attendees, especially the students. So anyone like, yes? Any question? Yes,
I see
Tunsi?
a
Yes,
hand.
Tunsi? Yes, Tunsi?
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, actually, I was reading your some of your works and your areas of expertise, and one of those was locative media.
Hmm.
I'm a little bit curious about that. Can you just tell us a little bit about your work? What is it first, and tell us a little bit about your works. I think that you published an essay or article. It's called Narrative Archaeology. And
Yeah,
yeah, I'm just curious about that.
yeah. Narrative archaeology. I grew up watching the Indiana Jones movies. Pretty fun. Some parts are definitely not very very aware of other cultures, but so the general concept of an archaeologist is you dig a hole and you stratify time by how far down you go. And in some areas that is accurate. My mom was before she got ill with multiple sclerosis, she was an archaeology student, and depending on how far down you got, you found different fossils. Like the Central Valley of California was actually once the ocean, and when she dug deep enough, she found shark bones, but at the surface they didn't exist. So narrative archaeology for me was, what if instead of going top down, you just go out in different directions? So if you think about narrative as archaeology, if you place stories in an area, back then was by GPS, now you can do it with wireless connected to GPS. That creates a possibility for archaeology of any place. You can take all the things in libraries or things that are just unknown, the ghosts of past that say only relatives or people that are elders in an area know, and you could allow it to exist. You're creating a new kind of archaeology. And I did a series of papers after that, but basically that was the fundamental idea. And I'm really happy it's become a field, because I thought, wow, this really feels like this is something important.
Thank you so much. So please, before I move to the second question, let me just remind you that maybe in 7 minutes, this first session will end. So I sent you the link to the second one for more questions, okay? So I give the floor to Omar, Mr. Omar.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you, Professor Murad, for organizing and moderating this
Thank you.
lecture event. And I would like to thank our special guest, Jeremy Hight. I was reading your article, Narrative Archaeology. I kind of lost, especially in terms, for example, when it comes to representations. Okay. Writers can use GPS and the apps, for example, to create space events and kind of selection of, let's say, of special events and experiences. Okay. In these terms, if we are not, for example, if we are not familiar with what we call digital or visual learners, okay, if we have this knowledge of how to analyze visuals and images. Yes, we live in age of digital social media, but still we lack these kind of interpreting text and images the way we do if we are what you call text-based learners. When we are text-based learners, for us, criticism or interpretation becomes a little bit easy. But when it comes to visual criticism, it's a little bit difficult for us to analyze the way we do with text. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. What I would recommend is if you do a Google search. I'm not paid by Google. If you search, that's semiotics right there. Like at least here in America, no one says search; they just say Google, which I'm sure Google's happy. But if you search locative narrative, and you go a few pages in, there are apps now that are free, that are assemblers for it, which is wonderful because I'm a writer first, and so I was thinking of the writing aspect, and I love history. But with the apps now, like my students at one of my universities can use it. If you have a skill set where you go, I'm not very technical, it's really easy to plug it together, and it still functions like a full locative narrative. And I'm happy about that because depending on your learning set, you can come at it. Some are visual, some are purely textual, some are more historical. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So we will move to the second session. So we will end this one. I will send you the link, so you click on it and we start a new one because it will get interrupted in 2 minutes. Okay, so see you in 1 minute, everyone. Thank you so much.